Welcome back, everybody, to Public Law. We're continuing talking about the sources of the UK Constitution, focusing again on the legislative process and statutory law. And we'll talk about the legislative and parliamentary process in this video. Now, this video is going to be very, very similar to that of our videos on the English legal system, covering essentially the same topic. And that's essentially because public law and the English legal system has a little bit of crossover at this particular stage. So it doesn't really make sense to just make two different videos. I'm just going to essentially redo this video again, but in the context of public law. So that's what I'm doing here. And we're talking about the parliamentary process in this video. This is the next and continuing, should I say, the major source of the UK Constitution, the idea of there being statute law. The next videos will start to move on and looking at the other sources of the Constitution, including the conventions, the common law, the royal prerogative, all of these different things. Like I said, we're going to start examining the process by which legislation is passed through Parliament, the process of a bill becoming a law. We know that a piece of legislation that has yet to receive royal assent is called a bill. And it is only a law, and it is only binding onto the people of the United Kingdom when it becomes a law through royal assent, so when it receives royal assent. So, the stages of parliamentary lawmaking are quite simple. The parliament that we have is a bicameral legislature, so there are two chambers through which a piece of legislation has to go. But the process by which it has to go through is the same in both houses. Okay, they have the same stages in both houses. So they go first through the House of Commons, then they go to the House of Lords. And they go through the following stages. They go through, firstly, a first reading. They then go through a second reading, a committee stage, a report stage. Depending on what happens at the committee stage, there may not be a report stage. We'll get to that in a second. A third reading, and then they go to the House of Lords for the exact same process before they then go and receive royal assent, assuming that the legislation does not die at any of these stages. Let's look at these in turn, one at a time, okay? So the first reading is the most simple, and it is probably the least impactful of the processes through which legislation is made. The first reading is simply the formal procedure of reading the bill to the House of Commons. They read the bill out loud to the House of Commons. They also make a declaration as to the compatibility of the legislation with the Human Rights Act in this part of the bill stage of the legislative process. But simply, this is what they do, okay? There is no room for debate or for deliberation at this stage, nor is there even a vote which takes place on taking the bill further. So every single piece of legislation, whether it pass into law or whether it just die at whatever stage through the process, will all go through a first reading process. And so it is only when we get to the second reading do we start to see deliberation, do we start to see debate, and do we start to see legislation die owing to the fact that there aren't votes to let it pass further. This is where there'll be a lot more debate and discussion on the bill itself. Now, the debate and the discussion is going into the general overview of the legislation, potentially the implications of the legislation. Sometimes there might be discussion and debate about very key provisions of the legislation, but there isn't that much in terms of the really minute details of the legislation, the specifics of the legislation. Rather, like I said, the second reading debates are supposed to focus on the intentionalities of the bill, the broader themes that pass in the passing of the bill, the general policy implications of the bill. Like I said, sometimes there may be discussions about particular provisions, where those provisions are very, very broad or very all-encompassing or very, very important. But it is not a stage where we see the very, very specific details of the bill discussed and the minutiae of the bill really, really amended and reformed and debated. At the end of the second reading, there will be a vote as to whether or not to take the bill to the next stage of the process. This will either be done verbally by the Speaker, where you the ayes or the nays, essentially. And if there is a division, they will clear the lobby, and you will have a formal vote take place. Essentially, when the speaker shouts "division, clear the lobby," what they're saying is the MPs have to go through and vote manually, essentially. And what they do and how they do that is will go through one of two doors. One door being the ayes to the right, or the noes to the left, and that's how they vote for particular pieces of legislation or amendments or decisions, etc., within Parliament. The next stage, if it goes to the next stage, if it doesn't die there and then, the second reading, and a lot of legislation does, but the next stage is the more substantive amendment stage. This is the committee stage, okay? This is where the real finer details of the bill are discussed and debated. The committee will consist of a selection of members of Parliament. Generally speaking, committees will represent and match the composition of the House of Lords. What does this mean? The House of Commons. What does this mean? Well, essentially, it means that if you have a House of Commons that is roughly 50% government party, and then maybe 25% the major opposition, and then there's maybe some other percentages there, the number of MPs and the percentage of MPs representing each party will be representative in the committee stage. So at this point, let's say at the time of recording, before the 2024 general election has taken place, the committee stages will be majority Conservative members of Parliament, with quite a substantial number of Labour MPs and quite a few SNP members of Parliament as well. That's generally how it is. Divided. And the reason for that, of course, is to show that essentially the committees should roughly reflect the will of the people. And so the will of the people is reflected in the composition of the House of Commons. Various amendments will be made to the legislation here, and they will also be voted on in the committee in question. There will be lots of back and forth about the finer details of the legislation, the implication of particular provisions, the wording of particular provisions, and all these different things that are established here. Now, if there are amendments that are made to the legislation in the committee stage, and for the most part there are, those amendments will then be reported back to the report stage, okay? If there are no amendments, then there will be no need for the report stage, because essentially the legislation will be exactly the same as it was when it passed through the second reading. But the report stage essentially allows the members of Parliament within the House of Commons to go through and see what the major changes were to the legislation that were made at the committee, and then they will debate on those changes, and they will either vote for whether they ought to be accepted, or they may vote for rejecting those amendments. If, like I said, there are no amendments, then there will be no need for a report stage, but it is very rare for a piece of legislation, especially when we're talking about some of the complex legislations that we see in the world today. It's very rare for those legislations to not have any amendments whatsoever at the committee stage. Finally, then, we have the third reading. Now, the third reading is almost as much of a formality than as the first reading, because by this point, by the report stage, and after the discussion on the report stage and the passing and accepting of the amendments made by the committees, the legislation is essentially complete at this point. Okay, or at least in the House of Commons, it is. Again, another formality process is done where there is another final vote on the bill. It's unlikely that you will see the bill fail at this stage, given that it has already passed all the previous stages. It doesn't seem to make much sense for an MP to then vote against it at this final stage. At that point, then, the bill will go to the House of Lords. It has gone through the House of Commons. It is then sent to the House of Lords, where it will go through the same process. It will go through a first reading, a second reading, a committee stage, a report stage, and a third reading. And it is for the House of Lords to really go and pick apart the legislation here. Now, Where the Lords will make amendments to the bill will then have to be sent back to the House of Commons for the House of Commons to approve those amendments. Remember, the House of Lords is an unelected chamber within Parliament. The House of Commons are the democratically elected members of Parliament, so therefore they will have the final say on every single amendment that is made by the House of Lords. This gives the House of Lords a sort of adjustment role, if you will. They essentially make small adjustments, and they use in some cases their expertise in certain areas of law and policy to make these amendments for the House of Commons to then approve. Sometimes a bill can go back and forth for quite a while, and this is a process known as ping-ponging, essentially going back and forth from the House of Commons to the House of Lords. Obviously, owing to the Parliaments Acts from the early 20th century, we know that if the House of Lords tries to block legislation, they can only block it for a certain period of time, and then eventually the House of Commons will be able to override the rulings of the House of Lords because of the authority and the power that the House of Commons has over the House of Lords. The Salisbury Convention tells us that any legislation that forms part of the winning political party's manifesto should not be voted down and blocked by the House of Lords, because essentially the view there is, if this is a manifesto pledge that is a piece of legislation, then it is seen to be part of the will of the people, and the unelected, undemocratic House of Lords should not be blocking or opposing the the elected will of the people by doing so. That's what the Salisbury Convention tells us. Finally then, once it's gone through these stages and it's gone through the ping-ponging process, as I like to call it, we have the royal assent phase. This is again a formality process, if anything more of a formality than any other stage of the process, and this is where the monarch will give royal assent to the bill to create the legislation. The Royal Assent Act of 1967 means that the monarch doesn't even have to see the text of the legislation anymore. It used to be the case that the monarch would read the legislation and then give royal assent, but because of the Royal Assent Act, there is not even a need to see the text. Simply put, the monarch will put their stamp of approval on the legislation and then let it go through, and there you go, sorted. The last monarch, by the way, that ever refused to give royal assent to a bill was Queen Anne in 1707. So you can really tell that this is such a formality process that it doesn't even really make sense to even call it a process. But nevertheless, it is a process, because this is if anything, it is paradoxically a formality that has no real legal standing whatsoever, but it also has the most legal standing, since it is what essentially creates the law itself. It is what turns a bill which has no binding authority to a law which can then have binding authority and be interpreted by the courts and have to apply and be enforced against people. So it's quite paradoxical in the sense that the most important part of the legislative process, the turning of a bill into a law, is actually the most formal, just most of the formalities of the process as well. So that's quite interesting.